Court ruling. Human male consul must marry alien grandchildren. Aridan had expected the High Court to deliver its ruling with the usual pomp, floating sigils, echoing trumpets, that one judge who always sneezed at dramatic moments. But he had not expected the verdict to involve his marital status. The chamber lights dimmed to a ceremonial blue, and the chief magistrate's voice boomed through the holographic lattice as if the universe itself had decided to mock him. He stood there, trying to look dignified while a swarm of recording drones bobbed around him like curious metallic gnats. The moment the words "must marry the emperor's granddaughter" were pronounced, one drone zoomed so close he instinctively swatted it, prompting gasps as if he had assaulted a sacred relic. The magistrates ignored the chaos, continuing solemnly, while Aridan wondered if resigning and becoming a quiet asteroid farmer might still be an option. Across the palace complex, Lirae received the news, with the kind of stunned silence usually reserved for catastrophic comet impacts. She sat in her private chamber, ears drooping so dramatically they nearly brushed her shoulders. Her attendants tried to congratulate her, but she waved them away, mortified by the idea that an entire galaxy now believed she needed a court ruling to find a husband. She buried her face in her hands and muttered something about fleeing to a remote moon and living among moss creatures who didn't care about arranged unions. Unfortunately, her grandmother, the emperor's sister, overheard and reminded her that moss creatures made terrible conversationalists. Their first meeting was scheduled under the palace dome, the massive crystalline structure glowing in its usual lavender hue, pulsing gently like a sleeping cosmic giant. Aridan arrived early, mostly because he wanted time to mentally prepare himself, and partially because he'd gotten lost twice on the way. The palace corridors had a habit of rearranging themselves for optimal ambience, which was architect code for "let's confuse important people for fun." He stood there rehearsing generic diplomatic greetings, trying to decide whether mentioning her ears would be diplomatic suicide. He had already offended 2 ambassadors that way in the past. He would not risk a third. When Lirae entered, she walked with careful grace, though her ears betrayed her nerves by twitching each time she inhaled. Aridan bowed respectfully, relieved that she looked more amused than horrified. She returned the greeting with a soft voice, one that trembled not with fear, but with an emotion he couldn't quite decipher. They both held the silence for a beat too long, as if waiting for a cosmic cue card to tell them what to do next. Finally, Aridan attempted humor, saying he hoped there wasn't a second court ruling requiring them to name their potential children before dessert. She let out a small laugh, the kind that startled her enough to make her ears flick upward. For a moment, the tension broke, replaced by a warmth that neither had expected. A cluster of court attendants hovered nearby, their glowing tablets ready to record every awkward detail. Aridan ignored them as best he could and focused on Lirae, who seemed equally eager to pretend they weren't being observed like rare zoo animals. She told him about her upbringing among the imperial gardens, where the plants were alive enough to hold grudges. He countered with a story about accidentally insulting a robotic customs officer who mistook his compliment for a proposal. The exchange spiraled into shared laughter, and soon they were walking beneath the dome as if they were 2 ordinary people rather than unwilling symbols of interstellar diplomacy. But every now and then, the reality of the situation slipped between the jokes. Lirae glanced at the distant court balconies, where political figures watched with the hunger of predators studying prey. Aridan noticed the subtle shimmer of surveillance nodes hidden in the dome's arches. Their worlds were enormous and heavy, and the union meant to bind them felt equally so. Still, when their eyes met, something softer pushed back against that weight, an unexpected spark neither had prepared for. At one point, Lirae admitted she had been terrified he would be stern, humorless, and 50 years older. Aridan confessed he'd feared she might be 3 meters tall and capable of telepathically detecting his embarrassing thoughts, particularly the one about running away to join a freighter crew. Her laughter echoed through the dome, and he found himself smiling like an idiot. The palace staff exchanged knowing glances, as if they could already sense the shift in the air, but neither Aridan nor Lirae were ready to acknowledge anything beyond the moment. They parted reluctantly, promising to meet again under less supervised circumstances, though both doubted such conditions existed for people in their position. As Aridan walked back toward the guest wing, he found himself replaying her smile, her voice, the strange sincerity in her eyes. Lirae, meanwhile, returned to her chambers, with her hands clasped over her heart, wondering how something meant to be political had suddenly felt personal. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, each carried the same thought as they stepped into their separate corridors. Perhaps this union, forced as it was, might not be the disaster they had feared. Perhaps, in the shadow of duty, something else was beginning, quietly, uncertainly, but undeniably real. Aridan woke the next morning to the sound of his door announcing intruders in the most cheerful tone possible. Before he could protest, 3 Imperial attendants swept into the room, carrying stacks of ceremonial manuals, all of which appeared heavy enough to double as blunt force weapons. One attendant informed him that he and Lirae would begin the pre-union compatibility rites immediately. Aridan asked if any rite involved less reading and more breakfast, but the attendant stared at him as if he had suggested eating the manuals themselves. He sighed, straightened his diplomat sash, and followed them out while promising himself that if any ritual required interpretive dance, he would resign from the galaxy. Lirae was already waiting in the Hall of Harmonious Futures, fidgeting with the edges of her cloak, while trying not to look mortified by the gold-plated statue of 2 lovers, holding hands, and also a treaty. She waved when she saw him, her ears lifting slightly in relief. Aridan offered a sympathetic smile, grateful not to be suffering alone. The Master of Ceremonies, a stern, elderly alien with eyes that blinked horizontally, materialized on a floating disk before them and declared that they would undergo a series of tests to determine emotional alignment. Aridan whispered that he hoped emotional alignment didn't involve synchronized swimming. Lirae covered her mouth to hide a laugh, and the Master of Ceremonies gave them a look suggesting humor was not part of the approved ritual. The first test required them to walk side by side across a platform that reacted to their combined emotional output. As they stepped onto it, the surface lit up in swirling colors, mostly shades of blue, which Lirae murmured meant mild anxiety, with a hint of, "Please don't let me embarrass myself." Aridan joked that his anxiety usually manifested as chartreuse, prompting a surge of bright green under their feet. The attendants scribbled notes furiously, while the Master of Ceremonies muttered something about unusual humans. By the time they reached the other side, the platform was flickering like a malfunctioning hollow advertisement, and Lirae whispered that they might have broken a sacred device. Aridan assured her that if anyone asked, they should blame it on solar interference. The second test involved the infamous compatibility scent ritual. Aridan tried to remain composed as an attendant presented him with a small crystal vial, claiming it held Lirae's harmonic essence. Lirae looked equally horrified when handed a vial containing his. They exchanged uneasy glances before taking tentative whiffs. Lirae blinked in surprise and said he smelled like warm ozone and soft citrus. Aridan admitted her smelled like starlight and fresh wind, then added quickly that he hoped starlight was a normal answer and not something that placed him on a watch list. The Master of Ceremonies nodded approvingly, though Aridan suspected the nod meant they won't be a complete disaster. Next came the resonant circle, a glowing ring on the floor where they were instructed to stand facing one another while maintaining eye contact. Aridan discovered immediately that maintaining eye contact with Lirae, while her ears twitched in embarrassed panic, was nearly impossible. She managed a steady gaze for 3 seconds before bursting into quiet laughter, which made Aridan laugh, which made the resonance circle flash gold in a way that caused the attendants to gasp. One whispered that gold meant potential synergy. Another whispered it meant deepening attachment. Aridan and Lirae exchanged urgent looks and silently agreed not to ask which interpretation was correct. Between rituals, they walked through the palace gardens, enjoying a brief reprieve from the ceremonial bombardment. Lirae apologized for the overwhelming traditions, admitting she found many of them ridiculous herself. Aridan reassured her that compared to the human ceremony, in which couples braided their biosignatures into a holographic lattice, this was actually fairly normal. She laughed and asked if the lattice ever malfunctioned. He answered that he had once seen one explode into glitter during a wedding, showering guests in nanobot confetti that took a week to deactivate. She stared at him in disbelief before dissolving into giggles that echoed through the glowing flowers. Their next trial involved a diplomatic riddle posed by a floating orb that claimed to predict the future of their union based on their answer. The orb asked what they valued most in a partner. Lirae hesitated and finally said honesty. Aridan said snacks. The orb spun rapidly, emitting confused tones before proclaiming their union statistically unpredictable. Lirae doubled over laughing, and Aridan declared they should take that as a compliment. The orb drifted away, muttering about recalibration. As the day wound down, their final test required simply walking together through the Hall of Prospective Destinies, a chamber filled with holographic stories of past diplomatic unions. Some were triumphant, some were disastrous. One ended because both parties ran off with the same starship captain. Aridan and Lirae lingered before each projection, sharing impressions, questions, and occasional jokes. Through the haze of expectation pressing down on them from all sides, something quieter began to weave itself between them. Trust formed through shared absurdity, companionship carved out of chaos. When the ceremonies concluded, they stood together outside the dome, exhausted but strangely lighter. Lirae admitted that she had expected the day to be humiliating, but instead it had been unexpectedly bearable, mostly because he was there. Aridan confessed that he had expected to be judged, sniffed, and possibly dissected, but she had made every ordeal feel survivable. They parted only when duty forced them to, but both carried the same unspoken realization, somewhere between the scent tests, glowing floors, and cosmic riddles. The idea of their union had shifted from impossible to maybe, perhaps even more than maybe. Aridan entered the diplomatic training chamber with the same expression one might wear when stepping into the mouth of a large and potentially hungry creature. The chamber lights flickered on as if waking reluctantly, and a holographic instructor materialized, an avatar with too many arms and an enthusiasm level that threatened public safety. Lirae stood beside Aridan, her ears angled forward in a display of resigned patience. She whispered that the training programs had been designed centuries ago by officials who believed diplomacy worked best when participants were mildly terrified. Aridan muttered that he was already achieving advanced-level terror and hoped that counted toward graduation. Their first exercise required them to pilot a small, very small, two-person hovercraft through a simulated asteroid field. Aridan squeezed into the cockpit, knees colliding with various buttons that beeped in angry protest. Lirae slid in beside him, trying not to laugh as he struggled to find a position that didn't feel like a form of intergalactic punishment. The instructor announced they must navigate together to symbolize unity, which Aridan suspected translated to argue while dodging rocks. The hovercraft shot forward, and Lirae took the controls with a confident flick of her wrist. Aridan, determined not to be useless, announced he would handle auxiliary functions, though he quickly discovered the auxiliary panel had only two buttons, one that dimmed the lights and one that played celebratory fanfare. He pressed the fanfare accidentally during a tight turn, startling both of them and sending the craft spinning dangerously close to a glowing asteroid. Lirae burst into laughter while correcting their course, and Aridan swore the simulation had been designed specifically to humiliate him. After surviving the asteroid chaos, they were herded into the Resonant Empathy Lab, which sounded suspiciously like a place where feelings went to be tortured. The lab required them to sync their emotional outputs using something called a bond amplifier, a device shaped like a metallic crown. When Aridan placed it on his head, it emitted a sound resembling a confused duck. Lirae assured him that meant it was calibrating, not judging. She set her crown onto her head, and the machine linked their signals with a soft hum. The instructor encouraged them to share a memory that revealed vulnerability. Aridan chose the moment he once tripped on stage during a planetary summit, crash-landing into a decorative fountain. Lirae shared the time she tried to befriend a telepathic bird, who responded by announcing her private crush to the entire garden staff. Their crowns blinked in synchronized pink lights, prompting the instructor to declare them emotionally resonant, though Aridan suspected that was just polite phrasing for mutually embarrassed. Their next session involved learning to read microexpressions from a series of holographic faces. The first face blinked, twitched, and smiled with unnerving speed, causing Aridan to lean back slightly and whisper that he did not trust anything with that many teeth. Lirae attempted to decipher the expression and announced it was mild surprise with a touch of amusement. The instructor informed her the correct answer was suppressed political rage. Aridan commented that this was exactly why he avoided high-level corporate meetings. Lirae giggled, earning a glare from the holographic avatar, who then switched to an even more unsettling face featuring 4 eyebrows. Their final training of the day was the Trust Descent, a misnamed activity involving a vertical drop through an anti-gravity shaft. Aridan tried to object, but the instructor insisted it build bonding confidence. Lirae offered him her hand as they stepped to the edge. Aridan accepted, mostly because he feared dying alone in a floating tube. They leapt together, and the anti-gravity field caught them, slowing their fall to a drifting glide. Lirae laughed as their bodies rotated gently. Aridan found himself laughing too, both from relief and from the ridiculousness of falling through a tube as a form of diplomacy. When they reached the bottom, they were met by attendants who applauded as if they had just achieved something monumental. Aridan whispered that if falling counted as diplomatic success, he was finally good at something. After the long sessions, they walked through the palace promenade, where glowing skyfish drifted lazily above the walkway. Lirae admitted she had dreaded the joint training, believing it would highlight their differences. Instead, she felt oddly reassured. Aridan confessed he had expected to embarrass himself in front of her at least 20 times, and had only managed 15, which he considered remarkable progress. Lirae laughed, her ears lifting in bright amusement, and he felt a warmth settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the palace climate controls. They stopped at a balcony overlooking the city, where neon skylines stretched beyond the horizon and hover lanes glimmered like rivers of light. Aridan joked that if this marriage failed, they could always run away and start a small courier business. Lirae said she would only agree if she got to name the ship. He asked what she'd call it. She answered immediately, the mildly attractive vegetable. Aridan groaned. Lirae grinned triumphantly. As they continued walking, their hands brushed. A fleeting contact neither commented on, but both felt ripple through them like a soft cosmic tremor. They said goodnight reluctantly at the corridor split, each lingering a moment longer than necessary. When Aridan finally returned to his quarters, he realized something subtle had begun shifting between them, something made from humor, shared chaos, and the slow intertwining of 2 lives forced together but beginning, unexpectedly, to move in sync. Aridan had just convinced himself that the palace was finally giving them a calm day. No rituals, no tests, no emotional syncing helmets shaped like household produce, when the ceiling alarms erupted in a shrill chorus that sounded suspiciously like panicking space parrots. He froze mid-sip of his morning tea as the lights turned crisis red. His first thought was that he had somehow triggered an alarm by thinking unkind things about the bond amplifier. His second thought was that Lirae was somewhere in the palace, and whatever was happening, they had better not be separated for it. He dashed into the corridor, where guards were sprinting past in organized chaos, shouting into comms about unverified intrusions and rogue signatures. Aridan flagged one down and asked if something dangerous was happening. The guard replied that they were still assessing, but probably. Encouraged by this precise clarity, Aridan rushed toward the east wing, where Lirae was scheduled for a meeting with the Imperial botanists. He hoped the sentient shrubs weren't involved. The last thing he needed was to battle rebellious foliage. When he arrived, he found Lirae already in the hallway, ears high with alarm, flanked by 2 protective attendants. She ran to him the moment she saw him, grabbing his arm with more force than expected. She told him someone had breached the palace's outer shield, someone who clearly disagreed with the Union. Aridan made a quick joke about hoping the intruder wasn't carrying more compatibility vials. Lirae tried to laugh but failed, the worry in her eyes outweighing humor. Together, they sprinted toward the inner chambers as guards herded personnel to safety. A sudden blast shook the corridor, sending a shower of dust and shimmering crystal fragments from the decorative archway. Aridan pulled Lirae behind a column as a spherical drone, clearly not part of palace security, barreled through the air firing stunned pulses like an overenthusiastic carnival game. Lirae reached into her hair. Aridan opened his mouth to ask why, then closed it again when she pulled out a slender metal hairpin and hurled it with impeccable aim. The pin struck the drone sensor, causing it to wobble drunkenly before crashing into a wall with a pitiful electronic whine. Aridan stared at her, speechless. She shrugged and said her grandmother always insisted hair accessories should be both fashionable and tactical. He made a mental note never to underestimate anything she wore ever again. Before they could catch their breath, a group of masked infiltrators rounded the corner, carrying compact plasma disruptors and looking entirely too serious for Aridan's preference. He pushed Lirae behind him out of instinct, though she immediately stepped beside him rather than hiding, which he suspected would become a pattern in their life. Together they ducked into a side passage as shots sizzled past, melting decorative panels in a way the palace staff would absolutely complain about later. Aridan and Lirae ran through a maze of hallways that seemed determined to relocate themselves mid-crisis, forcing them into a maintenance tunnel that reeked faintly of hot metal and very old socks. Aridan gagged and asked why royal architecture always smelled terrible behind the walls. Lirae informed him that the filtering system had been installed centuries ago by an emperor with poor taste and an unfortunate fondness for cheese-based air purifiers. Aridan declared that this finally explained all his sinus problems since arriving. They climbed down a narrow shaft, Lirae leading with surprising agility despite the formal robes she still wore. Aridan followed, slipping only 3 times, which he considered a heroic accomplishment. The tunnel vibrated above them as the infiltrators searched, their metallic footsteps echoing like angry thunder. When the noise faded, Aridan and Lirae exhaled at the same moment, leaning back against the cool metal and exchanging exhausted smiles. Lirae admitted quietly that she hadn't expected to be afraid, not truly afraid, of the consequences of their union until now. Aridan told her he'd been afraid since the moment he was assigned seating charts for the wedding, so this was a refreshing change of pace. She elbowed him gently, laughing under her breath, and the tension eased enough for both of them to breathe again. They navigated deeper into the maintenance network until they reached an exit hatch opening into one of the palace's undergardens, a space filled with softly glowing plants and drifting light spores. It was quieter here, sheltered from the chaos above. As they emerged, Aridan noticed Lirae, still gripping his sleeve, and she released it only when she realized she had nearly taken half his jacket with her. He told her she was welcome to keep the sleeve as a souvenir. Her ears twitched in amusement. Guards arrived moments later, securing the area and escorting them back to safety. As they walked, Aridan glanced at Lirae and saw something new in her expression, something fierce and bright beneath the fading adrenaline. She had fought beside him, protected him, trusted him without hesitation. When they finally reached the central dome, the Emperor herself appeared, demanding a full report. Lirae explained what had happened, keeping calm even as the Emperor muttered angrily about dissidents and compromised security grids. Aridan added that Lirae had single-handedly defeated a hostile drone with a hairpin, which made several guards look at her with newfound respect. When they were dismissed, Aridan and Lirae stepped out into the quiet corridor. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Aridan said softly that he hadn't realized how terrified he'd been of losing her until he faced the possibility. Lirae's ears dipped, overwhelmed. She stepped closer, touching his hand, and whispered that she felt the same. They stood there, hands intertwined, marked by danger and laughter and whatever had begun growing between them. Their union had stopped being political. It had become something worth risking their lives for. The palace buzzed with restless anticipation on the morning of the union ceremony, the kind of tension that made even the automated servants whisper. Aridan stood in his preparation chamber, adjusting his collar for the 7th time, convinced it had been designed by someone who hated necks. His advisor assured him he looked dignified. Aridan responded that any outfit requiring this much fabric was clearly a structural hazard. Still, beneath the nerves, something steady pulsed, an unexpected certainty that he wanted to walk into that dome and meet Lirae at its center, not because the court demanded it, but because the idea of not doing so felt wrong in a way he no longer tried to deny. Lirae was having her own crisis across the palace. Her attendants fluttered around her like anxious birds, securing ceremonial clasps and adjusting her cloak while she tried to remember how breathing worked. She admitted aloud, to no one in particular, that she had not felt as nervous even when disabling a hostile drone with a strategic hairpin. One attendant told her nerves meant destiny. Another said nerves meant indigestion. Lirae decided not to ask which interpretation was traditional. The ceremony began under the violet dome, its crystalline surface rippling with light that mirrored the galaxy's most distant stars. The court, the emperor, and more political figures than Aridan cared to count waited in respectful silence as Lirae walked down the central path. Aridan felt his chest tighten when he saw her, not because of duty or expectation, but because the sight of her, steady, luminous, ears trembling with barely contained emotion, hit him with the force of a supernova. When she reached him, she whispered that she hoped he didn't faint. Aridan whispered back that he'd only faint if she did first. A ripple of amusement moved through the dome. A few officials appeared scandalized, which only made Lirae smile wider. The officiant began the rites, weaving ancient words with holographic projections that sparkled around them. When instructed to join hands, they did so without hesitation. The moment their fingers intertwined, the resonant circle beneath them activated, glowing a soft gold. Lirae's eyes widened in surprise, and Aridan leaned in to murmur that this time he was fairly sure they hadn't broken anything. She stifled a laugh, ears flicking upward. As the vows approached, the court leaned forward, expecting stiff declarations of loyalty and diplomatic cooperation. Instead, Lirae spoke first, her voice clear and earnest. She admitted she had feared this union, feared losing herself to politics, feared being bound to a stranger she had not chosen. But in every test, every chaotic moment, every unexpected brush with danger, she found not a stranger, but someone who saw her as more than an imperial obligation. Someone she chose, fully and freely. Aridan's vow followed, delivered with quiet confidence he didn't recognize as his own. He confessed he had entered this arrangement prepared to obey, negotiate, and survive it. But Lirae had made him want more, made him want to be more. She challenged him, anchored him, and occasionally saved him from malfunctioning drones. He told her he wasn't marrying her for peace, or for duty, or because the High Court ordered it. He was marrying her because the idea of walking any path that didn't lead to her felt unbearably hollow. The officiant, visibly moved and slightly flustered, completed the rites quickly, perhaps to prevent further emotional destabilization of the court. The dome burst into shimmering light as the union was sealed, cascading golden waves rippling outward like a new star forming in real time. The emperor wiped a discreet tear. Several diplomats pretended they were simply adjusting their visual implants. As the applause rose, Aridan leaned toward Lirae and whispered that now they were officially united. Perhaps they should consider adopting a pet, something harmless, unlike the palace shrubs. Lirae replied that she had always wanted a miniature gravity whale. Aridan blinked, reconsidering their entire future, and she laughed so brightly that several skyfish gathered overhead in delight. The celebration that followed spilled into the night, filled with music, floating lanterns, and more holographic fireworks than planetary regulations technically allowed. Aridan and Lirae slipped away from the crowd eventually, finding themselves on a quiet balcony overlooking the galaxy-strewn horizon. Their hands intertwined again, naturally now, effortlessly. Lirae admitted she had grown in ways she never expected, that she had learned courage not from her lineage, but from choosing someone who saw her as herself. Aridan confessed he had changed too, that he had stopped approaching life like a negotiation and finally understood what it meant to want something simply because it made him feel alive. As they stood there, the echoes of the celebration drifting through the palace, Aridan asked softly what came next for them. Lirae smiled, her long ears tilting in warm certainty, and told him that whatever came next, they would face it together. Arguments, alliances, awkward court rituals, miniature gravity whales, all of it. Aridan nodded, feeling the truth of it settle into his bones. The union that once threatened to crush them had become their beginning. And somewhere high above the palace dome, the stars shimmered as if approving the story they had chosen to write together. The end.